Now, the sad news that the film star Val Kilmer, who played Batman, and Jim Morrison, as well as starring in Top Gun, has died at the age of 65.
I just had very simple objectives as an actor to try different things and challenge myself as often.
He gave the world the sound of danger. Not just a voice, but a kind of electricity that could cut through a cockpit, a courtroom, a desert, or a legend. Gravel and smoke and swagger, wrapped in a certainty that never once doubted it was the center of the universe. He could whisper a threat and make an entire room feel it in their bones. He could shout over a roaring jet engine and make the machine itself sound afraid. For 30 years, that voice carried him from a cramped drama school in Manhattan to the cockpit of the most famous fighter plane in cinema history, and it made him one of the most unforgettable men Hollywood produced. And then the cancer came for it. Not the body first, not the fame, not the fortune, not the glory, not the legend, the voice. The one instrument he had built an entire identity around, the one thing that made him unmistakable in a town full of beautiful, talented, desperate people. Silence D. Not by an enemy, not by age, not by a stage that stopped calling his name, by a disease that turned his own throat against him, one tracheotomy at a time, until the man who had once roared through the fires of Valhalla, who had once belted his way through the chaos of Jim Morrison, could barely manage to speak above a rasp. Think about that for a moment. Have you ever lost the one thing the world knows you for? The thing that makes you unmistakably you? The thing you cannot imagine living without? That single question sits at the very heart of the story of the man who played Iceman. Because what happened to Val Kilmer was not simply a tragedy of illness. It was a tragedy of identity. A man who lost the very thing that made him and then had to find a way to keep being himself anyway. This is not a story about a celebrity getting sick. This is a story about what it truly costs to carry a blazing, unhousable talent through a world that both loves and punishes you for it. It is a story about what remains of a man when the engine that powered his entire existence falls silent. It is a story about a Hollywood warrior who refused to disappear, even when his voice, the thing that defined him, had been stolen by a disease he could neither control nor escape. But before we reach the hospital room, before we reach the silence, before we watch a legend fade in real time, we need to understand who Val Kilmer truly was at the moment his voice was at its fullest. We need to understand the price of being that loud, that brilliant, that difficult, and that impossibly alive. We need to understand how a boy from the last day of the 1950s became the man who could not be ignored, and how that very refusal to be quiet would eventually become the thing that both defined him and cost him everything. So, stay with us, because this is a story that winds through a Manhattan drama school, through the deck of an aircraft carrier, through the sweltering chaos of the California desert, through the myth and madness of Jim Morrison, through the dusty, blood-soaked streets of a western town, through a throat that was slowly being eaten from the inside, and finally to a quiet grave that would hold one of the most electric performers American cinema has ever produced. The silence Val Kilmer would one day live in was not forged in a hospital. It was forged much earlier, in the loudest place a young man could find. Los Angeles, California. December 31st, 1959. The very last day of the decade, as if he had arrived late on purpose, as if he already knew he would never be early to anything, as if he was already refusing to arrive quietly. His parents did not hand him an easy road. His father, Eugene Kilmer, was a real estate developer and aerospace equipment distributor, a brilliant and exacting man. His mother, Gladys, came from a family that had known enormous wealth, and her own mother had lived through the madness of the gold rush, a family line that stretched back into a different, more dramatic age of American history. They divorced when Val was still young, and something in that early fracture left him hungry. It left him restless. It left him permanently unhousable, always searching for a place that would finally feel like home. And Val was not a comfortable child. He was strange. He was intense. He was the kind of boy who felt too much and wanted too much and could never be satisfied with the ordinary. He fought his way through childhood, carrying a loneliness that he would later try to fill with the only thing that ever understood him: performance. He did not drift into acting. He pursued it with the same white-knuckle intensity he would bring to every role that followed, the same intensity that would one day make him impossible to forget and, by some accounts, difficult to live with. He was not the kind of actor who waited to be discovered. He was the kind who broke down the door and demanded to be seen. At 17 years old, still barely more than a boy, he did something that no one could quite believe. Val Kilmer became the youngest student ever admitted to the drama division of the Juilliard School in New York City, the most prestigious performing arts conservatory in the United States. The place where the very best young actors in the world go to be forged into instruments of their craft. Here is what made it remarkable. He was a boy from a broken home in Los Angeles, still a teenager, standing among the most serious, most gifted young performers of his generation. And somehow, he was both the youngest person in the room and one of the most sure. He did not waver. He did not doubt. He walked into that school with the same blazing certainty that would follow him his whole life, and he absorbed everything: the discipline, the tradition, the weight of the stage. He co-wrote and starred in a student production. He studied the greats. He learned to inhabit a character so completely that the line between the man and the role would eventually blur into nothing. And then Hollywood came for him, as it always comes for the ones who simply cannot be ignored. His first roles arrived fast and strange, the way they do for actors who are too interesting to be overlooked. There was a wartime farce called Top Secret in 1984, where he played a rock and roll spy who somehow ended up in a world of absurdity and danger. And here was the proof that his face could be both absurd and magnetic at the same time, that he could make an audience laugh and lean in and believe all in one breath. Then came Real Genius in 1985, a brilliant, sideways comedy about the strange lives of physics students, where he played a genius too smart for the system and too human to resent it. He was funny. He was charming. He was strange. The public was beginning to notice this impossible young man with the face and the voice and the almost dangerous intensity. But the world had not yet heard the sound that would truly define him. That moment came in 1986, when a film about naval aviators took off across the world, and Val Kilmer slipped into a cockpit and became a myth. Top Gun. He played Lieutenant Tom Kazansky, the man they all called Iceman. The call sign was not a coincidence, because Kilmer's Iceman was all cold surface and coiled fire. He was the perfect, blazing equal to Tom Cruise's reckless maverick, the calm to Cruise's chaos, and the cool to Cruise's heat. He was the other half of the sky, and there is a moment in that film that became immortal. In the final, quiet beat, after everything had been tested and survived, Iceman turned to his old rival and delivered the line that an entire generation would memorize. "You can be my wingman anytime." It was not a surrender. It was an honor. It was Iceman, the man who did everything by the book, the man who would never be reckless, finally admitting to the one person he could not look away from that he had earned his place beside him. And in that moment, Val Kilmer became something he had been building towards his entire life. He became famous. The peak came in a furious, breathtaking rush, one unforgettable performance after another, as if the universe was trying to hold on to him before it lost him, as if it knew it would not have him for long. In 1991, he became Jim Morrison in Oliver Stone's The Doors, and he did not merely play Morrison. He inhabited him so completely that the boundary between the actor and the subject vanished into smoke. He rehearsed in darkened rooms. He studied the recordings obsessively. He lived inside the chaos of Morrison's world, the drugs, the madness, the music, and the fire, until it was impossible to tell where Kilmer ended and Morrison began. And the performance was not a performance. It was a possession, a spiritual takeover that left audiences stunned and convinced that they had been watching the ghost of Jim Morrison himself. It was proof, beyond any argument, that this man could do anything, that there was no role he could not vanish into, no soul he could not inhabit, no darkness he could not make beautiful. The doors announced to Hollywood that Kilmer was not a movie star. He was a force of nature wearing a human face. Then came Batman Forever in 1995, where he took up the mask of the Dark Knight. He took the mythology of Batman absolutely seriously, with the full weight of a man who understood that this was not just a comic book, that this was a legend, and he poured everything into it. But the production was not smooth. Kilmer, ever exacting, collided with the process, demanding more of the film than was being given. He did not merely commit to the role. He wrestled with it, the way he wrestled with everything, and the film became the source of enormous behind-the-scenes drama that would follow his name for years. But it was another performance, in a film that began almost as a footnote and became one of the most beloved pieces of American cinema ever made, that would outlive everything else he ever did. In 1993's Tombstone, Val Kilmer became Doc Holliday, the tubercular, whiskey-soaked, doomed gunslinger, a man whose body was dying but whose spirit was still sharp as a blade. And in that role, he delivered one of the most quoted performances in American film history. A line that became tattooed onto the culture itself, spoken in that low, slow, dying drawl, a phrase that would be repeated by generations who had never even seen the film. "I'm your huckleberry," Doc Holliday said, and it was not just a line. It was a declaration of a man who had nothing left to lose, a man who would stand against anyone because he was already dying. And dying men are the most dangerous men of all. It is the line people have said to each other for 30 years. It is the line that would become the title of Kilmer's own memoir, the autobiography of a man whose voice was being taken from him. But look closely at that performance, because it carries a prophecy that none of us saw coming. Doc Holliday was a brilliant man whose throat was being eaten by disease. His voice was dying, and he knew it. And he smiled through the ruin and kept fighting anyway, because he refused to be defined by the thing that was killing him. Kilmer poured his entire future into that dying voice, and the audience felt it, even if they did not know why. They watched a man lose his voice to illness and keep his spirit alive, and they did not know they were watching the exact blueprint of Kilmer's own ending. The performance was a prophecy, written 20 years before the disease came for him. Here is a question worth sitting with. What would you do if you were handed the exact blueprint of your own fate years before it happened, and you could not see it? What if the greatest role you ever played was secretly the story of your own ending, and you had no idea? Because Val Kilmer played a man losing his voice to disease before cancer ever touched his throat, and that piece of art would haunt him. Keep that in mind as we continue. The roles kept coming, and the intensity kept rising. He was Batman. He was in Heat, the great crime film. He was in the wilderness of every genre Hollywood could offer, and he brought the same thing to every single one of them: total, all-consuming intensity. He built a reputation, forged in fire, as one of the hardest men to work with in the entire industry. Demanding, uncompromising, known to collide with directors, to rewrite pages, to fight for his vision, to be both difficult and brilliant in the same breath. People called him crazy, and people called him a genius, and neither label ever changed the way he worked. He did not care. He was on a mission to burn brighter than anyone, to be the very best, to give everything to the craft until there was nothing left of him to give. And the whole world saw him, a man of impossible talent who could not be tamed. That is what made what happened next so unbearably difficult to watch. Because the man who burned that bright was about to learn exactly what happens when the fire finally, quietly turns inward. When the thing that made him so alive becomes the thing that destroys him. At the height of everything, just as the iconic roles and the difficult reputation and the raw, unrepeatable talent had made him a byword for intensity, Val Kilmer's body began to betray him, not with a dramatic collapse. Cancer rarely announces itself that way. It is a disease of patience, of small warnings, of little signs that a body can easily ignore. It began with a throat, a hoarseness that would not heal, a roughness in the voice that was the instrument of his whole life. a small warning sign that he and everyone around him tried so hard to explain away. And then, in 2015, the diagnosis finally had a name: throat cancer. It had arrived. Now here is the particular cruelty of this disease. Cancer anywhere is a tragedy, but there is something almost surgical in the cruelty of throat cancer in a man who was built entirely around his voice. Val Kilmer's voice was not just a part of his identity, it was the very engine of his life. It was the instrument he had trained at Juilliard. It was the weapon he had used to conquer every scene, every role, every audience. And now the disease was inside the very instrument he lived in. The cancer had come for the one thing he could not afford to lose. The treatment was brutal. It took everything he had. It ravaged his body, his throat, and his ability to breathe, to swallow, and to speak. And then came the tracheotomy, the first one. A surgical opening in his throat to help him breathe, a measure of survival that came at an unimaginable cost. And then, because the cancer was cruel and tenacious, because it would not give up easily, there came a second tracheotomy. 2. A double mark of a disease that was trying to take his very life. And with those 2 tracheotomies came something that no medicine could fully restore, something that no amount of surgery could give back to him: his voice. His voice was gone, not diminished, not changed by age, not weakened by illness and then recovered. Gone. The voice that had electrified 3 decades of audiences, that had made him a myth, that had carried him from Juilliard to the deck of an aircraft carrier to the white mask of Batman and the dying drawl of Doc Holliday, was gone. And the man who had been defined by that voice now had to learn how to exist without it. Think about the weight of that for a second. When the world knows you only by a sound, and that sound is taken away, what is left of you? What do you become when the very thing that made you recognizable, that made you special, that made you the man you knew yourself to be, is stripped away by a disease you did not ask for and cannot control? Val Kilmer did not disappear. He did not vanish into bitterness, although no one would have blamed him if he had. Instead, he learned to speak again through technology. He used a reconstructed voice, a machine that helped him form words, a voice that was recognizably his own but no longer the thunder that had once filled a stadium. It was not the old voice. It was a translation. It was an echo. The thunder was gone, and in its place was something quieter and, somehow, more honest. He would describe in public, with the voice he had left, that he wanted to be healthy, that he wanted to recover, that his faith had carried him through. He would speak about the disease with the same bravery he had always brought to his work. And behind him, through every interview, through every appearance, through every attempt to reconnect with the world, there was the reality he could not escape. He had lost his voice. And no amount of will, no amount of courage, no amount of his legendary intensity could bring it back. And this is where the story of Val Kilmer takes a turn that very few people ever get to write. Because he did not retire. He did not disappear into bitterness, although the grief of losing his voice would have justified it 100 times over. He did not accept the end of his story. Instead, he rearranged his entire life around the thing that had always saved him. And that thing was art. In 2020, he published his memoir, I'm Your Huckleberry, a title borrowed, of course, from the very line that made him a legend, but now carrying a second, darker, more honest meaning. In it, he did not hide. He wrote about the roles, the reputation, the brilliance, the difficulty, the love, and the loss. He laid his whole life out for the world to see, without flinching, because the man who had lost his voice had found another way to speak, and he was going to use it. Then, in 2021, he released the documentary, Val. And that documentary was a gift, a portrait of a man that almost no one had ever seen. It was assembled from the archival footage he had shot himself relentlessly for decades. Val Kilmer had been filming himself his entire life. He had been pointing a camera at his own genius and his own madness and his own impossible beauty since he was a young man, recording his own life on tape, not knowing what it was for. In Val, the world finally saw him as he had never been seen. Not the icon, not the legend, not the myth, the man. A man using a machine to speak. A man who had once been one of the loudest voices in Hollywood, now communicating through a mechanical rasp that had to be typed and spoken for him. And at the end of that documentary, in one of the most moving moments ever captured on film, Kilmer looked into the camera, and with the voice he had so painfully rebuilt, he gave one of the most honest portraits an artist has ever left behind. He did not flinch from the confession at the center of it, that he had given so much of himself to the work, to the craft, that he had not always given enough to the people who loved him. He held his own life up to the light and showed it exactly as it was, beautiful, broken, brilliant, and true. It was the most honest thing he had ever made, and it became the closest thing to a final portrait he would ever leave. And then, in 2022, Hollywood gave Val Kilmer the one ending that the great stories are made of. It came in Top Gun, Maverick, the long-delayed sequel to the film that had made him a myth, more than 3 decades after Iceman first walked onto that carrier deck. The world did not know if he could do it. His voice was gone. He could barely speak. But there he was, in the film, back again, the same face, the same Iceman, older, quieter, and changed. He had returned for a scene that would break the heart of every person who had ever loved Top Gun. On screen, Iceman, now a commanding officer, meets his old rival Maverick one last time. And in that scene, shot with enormous care and tenderness, Iceman, whose voice has been altered by illness, exactly like Kilmer's own, speaks to his old friend in short, careful lines, typed onto a screen and delivered with the weight of an entire life. The scene is not a trick. It is not a stunt. It is true. A man who had lost his voice was playing a man who had lost his voice, and the line between the actor and the character disappeared into nothing, just as it always had, but this time with the weight of his real illness behind it. The audience wept, not because the scene was designed to be sad, but because it was true. Because they could see a man who had lost so much still finding the courage to stand in front of the world and deliver his own story. He proved, in that one scene, that a performer is not defined by what he can project. He is defined by what he can still give. He proved that the voice is not the man, that a legend is not a sound, and that the spirit that burned for so long could survive even when the engine of it was gone. And he gave the world the grace of seeing him whole, complete, and a legend one final time on the biggest screen he had ever owned. But the story was not over. Because of the years of treatment, the 2 tracheotomies, and the body that had been through its own war, it had left behind a fragility that no amount of courage, no amount of will, could ever cancel. In the early months of 2025, Val Kilmer fell ill. The body that had carried him through a lifetime of fire and of grace, of brilliance and of pain, had grown weak. And on the 1st of April, 2025, in Los Angeles, the man who had once played Jim Morrison, Batman, Doc Holliday, and Iceman, one of the most electric forces ever to grace the screen, was gone. The cause of his death was pneumonia. He was 65 years old. His daughter, Mercedes Kilmer, confirmed the news to the New York Times. She said her father had been diagnosed with throat cancer years earlier, that he had been treated, and that he had later recovered, but that ultimately it was pneumonia that had taken him. She said he was loved and that he would be missed. She spoke of the man she had loved, the father she had watched, the genius she had known. And in a separate interview with Peoply, she paid him the most beautiful tribute a daughter could give. She said her father was so talented that he could artfully circumvent the limitations of his speech, and that she had learned from him how to communicate physically in ways that had expanded what she thought acting could even be. She described watching him rebuild his life without his voice and learning from it what true strength looked like. There is a particular cruelty in the timing of this death. Val Kilmer was not just at the end of his life. He was in the middle of the most meaningful chapter he had ever known. He had survived cancer. He had rebuilt his voice with a machine. He had made his documentary. He had been welcomed back onto the biggest screen of his career, He had finally found a way to be known as a man as well as a performer, to be loved not just for the roles he had played, but for the person he had become. And then the body that had carried him through all of it, the instrument that had burned so bright for 65 years, simply gave out. He did not lose to cancer, not in the end. He did not lose to the disease that had silenced him, the disease he had fought so hard and so long to defeat. He simply ran out of road. He reached the end of his story, like Doc Holliday, the character he had played in his youth, a man who had defied the dying of his voice and kept fighting anyway, because that is what warriors do. They fight. And he was a warrior, a quiet warrior, all the way to the last breath. What do you do with the time you have left when the thing that defined you is gone? What do you become when the world no longer knows how to recognize you? What do you do when the thing you were known for, the thing that made you valuable, the thing that gave your life its meaning, is taken away from you and you cannot bring it back? Val Kilmer's answer was not to stop. It was not to give up. It was not to disappear. His answer was to build a new voice, one typed instead of spoken, one carried by technology, one that lived in the pages of his memoir and in the frames of his documentary and in the courage of his return. He took his silence and he made it into a testimony. He took his loss and he made it into a legacy. And perhaps that is the real tragedy and the real triumph of Val Kilmer. The tragedy is that the world could not keep him. A man who was so alive, so impossible, so unforgettable, reduced at the end to a whisper that had to be written down. The tragedy is that he had so much left to give, and the instrument that carried it had been mortgaged to cancer and then to time. The tragedy is that one of the greatest voices of the cinema was taken down by a disease that attacked the very instrument of his gift. But the triumph is this. He was not the center of his own legend only because of the roles, although those roles were enough to make him eternal. He was the center of his legend because of the way he went quiet, because of the way he faced the one thing he feared most in the world, the loss of his identity and the loss of his voice, and he refused to let it erase him. He refused to let the silence own him. He refused to let the loss become the whole story. When the world stopped hearing Val Kilmer, he taught himself to be heard in a different way. He kept going. He kept making it. He kept living. He died loved, a warrior still, a huckleberry to the end. Because here is the truth that Val Kilmer's life leaves with us, and it does not belong to a single one of his films. We are not defined by the strength of the voice we are given. We are defined by what we do with it and by what we do when it is taken away. Val Kilmer spent his life being one of the loudest talents in Hollywood, and he ended it by showing all of us how to be brave in the quiet. He taught us that identity is not a voice, it is a will. That legacy is not the volume of what you said, but the truth of what you kept trying to say. And that a man can lose everything that made him recognizable and still choose to be himself. He taught us that some people are too bright to be silenced, and that the silence of a bright person is still a kind of light. That a voice is not the heart, and the heart, even after the last breath, is still speaking. Val Kilmer has gone quiet now, but the man who lost his voice taught the world that the voice was never the heart, and that the heart that held him, the heart that carried him through, the heart that refused to surrender, is still speaking, and it always will be.